In the shadows of history, a forbidden practice took root within the royal palaces of Europe, one so dark, it threatened to destroy entire bloodlines and empires. The practice was inbreeding, and it wasn't merely a private indulgence, but a deeply ingrained tradition. It was used by the most powerful families of the time, not out of love or desire, but out of a twisted, almost desperate need to preserve power. They believed that by marrying within their own family, they could maintain a pure bloodline, secure their thrones, and keep their wealth within the royal walls. But what was the true cost of this practice? What happens when bloodlines are so tightly bound that the very monarchs who hold the power are themselves fractured, broken by generations of genetic corruption? One of the most tragic and infamous examples of this practice can be found within the Spanish Habsburg dynasty. A family that ruled over vast territories in Europe, the Habsburgs were known for their great power, immense wealth, and their unyielding belief in preserving their bloodline. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Habsburgs reigned supreme. Their empires stretched across Europe, controlling Spain, Austria, parts of Italy, and even the New World. But behind the grandeur of their palaces and the glitter of their crowns, something sinister was unfolding. Their unrelenting focus on keeping the throne in the family gave rise to a horrifying reality, one that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the once mighty dynasty. The Habsburgs' tradition of marrying within the family was born from an idea that, on the surface, seemed practical. In an era when monarchies were constantly threatened by external enemies and internal strife, it made sense to ensure that power remained within the family. Inbreeding was seen as a way to keep the royal bloodline pure, ensuring that the throne would remain in the hands of the same family for generations. And at first, it worked. But as the generations passed, the devastating effects of inbreeding became more and more apparent. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, the Habsburg family had been marrying close relatives for over 2 centuries. Charles was the product of this long-standing tradition of inbreeding. His parents, King Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were first cousins, and his ancestors had been marrying within the family for generations. The result was a sickly and deformed child who would grow up to inherit a throne in name only. From the moment of his birth, it was clear that Charles II was not like other children. His head was large for his body, his jaw protruded unnaturally, and he had a pronounced underbite. His features were so grotesque that some of the royal courtiers referred to him as the Bewitched, a nickname that hinted at the eerie aura surrounding his condition. His body was frail, and his movements were slow, almost as if he were struggling to even hold himself up. He was often ill, and doctors found it difficult to determine the exact cause of his ailments. As he grew older, his deformities became more pronounced, and his mental faculties began to show signs of deterioration. Charles II struggled with learning disabilities, and his inability to speak coherently and clearly set him apart from other monarchs of his time. His speech was slurred, and he often had difficulty processing information. It is believed that Charles may have suffered from severe cognitive impairments due to the severe inbreeding in his family tree. In his early years, he had a lack of control over his bodily functions, and his physical weakness made him incapable of participating in the affairs of the kingdom. His early years were marked by fragility and isolation, both physically and emotionally. As Charles II grew older, his health continued to decline, and he became increasingly dependent on his family and advisors. His mother, Mariana of Austria, served as regent for much of his early life, and his marriage was arranged in an attempt to secure the throne for future generations. But even though he married twice, Charles II was unable to produce an heir. It was believed that his deformities and weak constitution rendered him infertile, and this only further deepened the crisis facing the Spanish monarchy. Despite his lack of heirs, Charles II remained king for much of his life, his reign marked by a sense of tragic irony. Here was a monarch, born into one of the most powerful families in Europe, who was unable to fulfill the most basic duty of a ruler, producing an heir to carry on the family legacy. The Spanish court, once a grand center of European power, was now filled with whispers about Charles II's condition. His inability to rule effectively and his deteriorating health led to a weakened monarchy, and factions within the court began vying for power. While the kingdom slowly fell into chaos, the Habsburg family refused to relinquish their grip on the throne. In fact, they doubled down on their belief that the bloodline must be preserved at all costs, even though it was becoming painfully clear that the result of their obsessive inbreeding had created a broken ruler. The royal family's blind devotion to blood purity led to increasing isolation from the people and the growing realization that the throne was not only empty of heirs but increasingly empty of hope. The political instability that Charles II's reign caused reached its apex when he died in 1700. His death marked the end of the Habsburg dynasty's rule in Spain. The Spanish War of Succession, which followed his death, was the result of competing claims to the Spanish throne, and it led to a major shift in European power dynamics. The war was fought between two factions, the Habsburgs, who hoped to retain their grasp on the throne, and the Bourbons, who sought to claim the crown for their own. The Habsburgs' inability to produce an heir, combined with the devastating effects of inbreeding, ultimately doomed their dynasty, leading to the rise of the Bourbon family in Spain. Charles II's death and the collapse of the Habsburgs signaled the end of an era for Spain, but it also marked a broader shift in the European royal landscape. The consequences of inbreeding were not just felt within the walls of the royal palaces but throughout the entire nation. Spain, once a mighty empire, was left fractured, weakened, and vulnerable to foreign influence. The royal family's obsession with maintaining a pure bloodline had led to the complete collapse of their reign, and their inability to adapt and change had ultimately caused their downfall. As the Habsburgs faded into history, the scars of their bloodline remained. The story of Charles II serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of obsession with power and purity at any cost. The price of royal inbreeding was not just the ruin of a single family, but the unraveling of an empire, and the collapse of a once thriving monarchy. The tragic story of the Spanish Habsburgs is not an isolated one. In fact, the practice of royal inbreeding plagued several European monarchies, each with its own devastating consequences. The obsession with preserving royal bloodlines and consolidating power within a family ultimately led to a series of grotesque and catastrophic failures across multiple royal houses. The very practice that was meant to secure the future of these dynasties only sowed the seeds of their destruction. As the Spanish Habsburgs fell from power, the ripple effect could be seen in the fate of other royal families. The most notable example of this is found in the Bourbon dynasty of France. The Bourbons, like the Habsburgs, often married within their own bloodline to maintain their grip on power. However, their practice of inbreeding was not as extreme as that of the Habsburgs, and their political and genetic troubles were somewhat less visible, though still significant. One of the most notorious cases of inbreeding in the Bourbon family came with the marriage of Louis XVI of France and Marie Antoinette, the Austrian Archduchess. Although they were not direct first cousins, their families were closely related through multiple generations of intermarriage. Louis XVI himself, though not physically deformed like Charles II, suffered from significant mental health issues, including depression and an inability to effectively govern. He struggled to assert his authority, and his indecisiveness ultimately contributed to the collapse of the French monarchy during the French Revolution. Louis XVI's inability to rule was compounded by the fact that he was married to Marie Antoinette, a woman who was also not immune to the consequences of royal inbreeding. Their marriage, initially one of political convenience, became a source of scandal and tension within the French court. Despite their efforts to produce heirs, their early years of marriage were marked by failure in this regard. It wasn't until years after their marriage that Marie Antoinette gave birth to the long-awaited royal heir, but by that time, the damage had already been done. The French Revolution was already beginning to take shape, fueled by widespread discontent with the monarchy's excesses, and the royal family would soon find themselves in grave danger. In the Russian Empire, another royal family fell victim to the same tragic cycle. The Romanovs, who had ruled Russia for over 3 centuries, also practiced inbreeding, though they were less blatant about it. The most infamous example of the Romanovs' genetic troubles is found in their son, Alexei Nikolaevich, the heir to the Russian throne. Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents the blood from clotting properly. This condition, which was inherited from his mother, Alexandra Romanov, caused tremendous pain and suffering for the young heir. The disorder was passed down through the royal family due to generations of intermarriage between the European monarchies, most notably the Habsburgs and the Romanovs. Alexei's hemophilia was a constant source of worry for his parents, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. The family's fear for their son's health became all-consuming, and it's said that they turned to mysticism in an attempt to save him. They sought the help of Grigory Rasputin, a mystic and self-proclaimed healer, who was believed to have some ability to control Alexei's bleeding episodes. Rasputin's influence over the royal family grew, and his presence at court became more and more controversial, especially as his political interference began to undermine the credibility of Tsar Nicholas II's rule. The Romanovs' obsession with maintaining their bloodline and their reliance on Rasputin only exacerbated the instability of the Russian Empire. The once mighty Romanov family, weakened by generations of inbreeding and the genetic flaws passed down through the family, found themselves increasingly vulnerable. The Russian Revolution of 1917 would bring an end to their rule, and Tsar Nicholas II and his family were executed by Bolshevik forces, marking the brutal end of the Romanov dynasty. But perhaps the most tragic and irreversible effects of royal inbreeding are seen in the way these families were viewed by the common people. The elites, obsessed with the idea of preserving royal bloodlines, ignored the suffering and decline of their own families. The political and social unrest that followed the dynastic failures led to revolutions, uprisings, and the ultimate collapse of many of Europe's once great empires. As these royal families descended into chaos, they lost the very support they needed to survive. The power of monarchy was shattered, not just by revolutionaries, but by the internal weaknesses that royal inbreeding had wrought upon them. The consequences of royal inbreeding stretched far beyond the walls of palaces and the confines of royal courts. Entire empires crumbled under the weight of genetic dysfunction, as the rulers who should have held power with wisdom and strength were instead diminished by their own family's dark secrets. The notion of preserving power within the family had led to a twisted form of monarchy, one that lacked the strength, resilience, and vitality necessary to endure the challenges of the changing world. The dynasties that engaged in this practice, driven by their desire to keep power within the family, ultimately ensured their own demise. Their fixation on blood purity and the preservation of royal lines left them blind to the dangers of genetic defects, mental illness, and the breakdown of their family's ability to lead. What they thought was a means of protecting their legacy became the very thing that destroyed it. And yet, despite the ruin that royal inbreeding left in its wake, there are those who continue to argue that the practice was a natural outgrowth of monarchy's obsession with control and power. Some even claim that these genetic flaws, while tragic, were just a part of the cost of maintaining the power and prestige that came with the throne. But for those who lived through the horrors of these families' reigns, the truth was clear: the price of preserving royal bloodlines was far too great. As the world watched these royal families descend into madness and ruin, one thing became certain: there was no escaping the consequences of playing God with human genetics. And while the names of these families may have faded from the pages of history, the scars they left on the world remain. The fallout from the dynastic failures caused by inbreeding wasn't just confined to the palaces and courts of Europe. The effects rippled across the globe, influencing the politics, power structures, and even the very fabric of society. As royal families crumbled and monarchies were overthrown, the practice of inbreeding slowly became a dark cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers of power and control being passed down through flawed and twisted bloodlines. The tragic stories of families like the Habsburgs, Bourbons, and Romanovs left behind not only devastated royal houses but also an empire of shattered legacies and broken dreams. But even after the fall of these monarchies, the influence of inbreeding continued to haunt Europe for generations. Inbreeding, after all, was not a practice limited solely to kings and queens. It was prevalent among the elite families of the time, who viewed marriage as a tool to consolidate power and wealth. The same fixation on blood purity that had driven royal families to marry cousins and uncles continued to permeate the upper echelons of society. Even after the revolutions and the fall of the great dynasties, the myth of blood purity lingered, leaving behind a social and political landscape that struggled to break free of the past. Yet, the legacy of inbreeding did not disappear so easily. Many of the effects of these genetic catastrophes lingered for generations, hidden behind the walls of powerful families who still sought to preserve their bloodlines. The results of centuries of inbreeding, mental instability, physical deformities, and weakened leadership, remained imprinted on the very fabric of royal and aristocratic bloodlines. These problems weren't easily solved, and the scars left by generations of genetic manipulation were not so quickly erased. For the people who had once served under these broken monarchies, the collapse of royal families brought both a sense of relief and a deep sense of loss. The power structures that had held the world in place for centuries were now gone, leaving behind a power vacuum that would take generations to fill. The fall of monarchies, once seen as a noble and unshakable part of society, was now exposed as fragile and easily undone. In the wake of this collapse, the very nature of power itself was forever changed. However, it wasn't only in Europe where the consequences of royal inbreeding left its mark. The practice had far-reaching effects, not just on the royals themselves but on the societies they ruled. The downfall of these dynasties gave rise to a new era, one marked by uncertainty and instability. The transition from monarchical rule to more democratic or revolutionary systems was turbulent and filled with conflict, but it also sparked profound changes in how people viewed power. No longer were bloodlines seen as the ultimate determinant of legitimacy. New ideas about merit, governance, and public welfare began to take root. In some ways, the suffering caused by inbreeding accelerated the collapse of outdated systems and paved the way for new political philosophies. But the collapse of royal families and the subsequent shift in power did not heal all wounds. The people who had suffered under the weight of royal misrule and the genetic weaknesses of their monarchs were left to rebuild, often from the ashes of centuries of oppression. While the monarchy's collapse opened the door to new possibilities, it also left behind a fractured and struggling world that had to pick up the pieces. One of the most chilling reminders of the catastrophic consequences of royal inbreeding lies in the question of whether the practice would be repeated. As the world moved into the modern era, there was still a lingering belief in the power of bloodlines, the idea that the ruling class was inherently superior, whether because of their lineage, wealth, or status. This obsession with purity and inheritance continued to shape political decisions and cultural beliefs, even as the old monarchies fell. In fact, the obsession with blood purity extended far beyond European royalty. It influenced social and political movements around the world, with eugenics gaining traction in the early 20th century. Though the idea of eugenics was officially discredited and condemned, the underlying belief that human beings could be improved through controlled breeding remained embedded in some parts of society. The dark history of royal inbreeding, with its grotesque results and devastating consequences, had unknowingly paved the way for even more horrific ideologies about race, genetics, and social order. The story of royal inbreeding, particularly within the Habsburg, Bourbon, and Romanov families, serves as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of concentrated power, the consequences of selfishness and obsession with preserving lineage at all costs, and the frailty of those who believe they are invincible simply because of their blood. It also raises troubling questions about the nature of power and the lengths to which rulers will go to secure their legacy, even when the cost is the health, well-being, and future of their own bloodlines. But, as we've seen, the end of one era doesn't mean the end of its lessons. The fall of the royal houses exposed the dark underbelly of monarchy and aristocracy, where inbreeding and political manipulation went hand in hand. The impact of this history can still be felt today, not just in the histories of the fallen monarchies but in the ways we think about power, bloodlines, and the ruling class. What remains is the unsettling truth that, in the quest for power, families can destroy themselves from within. These dynasties, once proud and untouchable, fell victim to their own desires, their own need to maintain control and purity at any cost. Their broken bloodlines serve as a haunting reminder that there is no such thing as a bloodline too pure to be corrupted. The cost of preserving royal power through inbreeding, whether it was the weakening of the body, the degradation of the mind, or the eventual collapse of entire empires, was a price too steep to pay. As we look back on this history, we are left with the chilling knowledge that even the most powerful families are vulnerable to the destructive forces within their own blood. The story of royal inbreeding is not just the story of kings and queens, but of entire empires, empires that believed they were invincible but ultimately crumbled under the weight of their own twisted legacies. And with that, we are left to wonder, is there truly any power, any legacy, strong enough to defy the inevitable consequences of history's darkest secrets? As the centuries have passed, the story of royal inbreeding and its catastrophic consequences remains a chilling reminder of the fragility of power. The once great dynasties, which seemed to rule with unchallenged authority, were ultimately undone by their own desperate pursuit of control, by their obsessive need to preserve bloodlines at any cost. The collapse of these powerful families was not just a fall from grace, it was a destruction of their very essence, their legacy tainted by the very blood that was meant to fortify them. The damage wrought by inbreeding within these royal families, whether it was the physical deformities, the mental impairments, or the political instability, was far-reaching and long-lasting. Entire empires were weakened, their thrones shaken by rulers who were, in many ways, broken from the start. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, and the Romanovs, each family thought they could outlast time, that their bloodline could endure forever. But time has proven that no family, no matter how mighty, can withstand the rot within. In the aftermath of their downfall, new systems of governance emerged, driven by ideals that rejected the ancient, blood-based rule. Revolutions, uprisings, and new political movements sought to dismantle the structures of power that had allowed such decay to fester for so long. The end of the royal reigns marked the dawn of a new era, one where bloodlines were no longer the sole claim to power. But even in their absence, the shadow of those royal families still looms. The very obsession with blood that destroyed them, continues to haunt the world, reminding us of the dangers that come with concentrating power in the hands of the few. And as we reflect on this dark chapter of history, one truth stands clear: in the end, no bloodline, no matter how pure, is invincible. The pursuit of perfection, the desire to maintain control through genetic purity, came at a cost so great that it destroyed not just the families involved, but the very nations they ruled. The rise and fall of these dynasties are etched in history as cautionary tales of unchecked power, of human frailty, and the irreversible consequences of attempting to control the uncontrollable. The story of royal inbreeding may be centuries old, but its lessons are timeless. For as long as we continue to place our faith in the preservation of power through blood, we risk repeating the same mistakes. And so, we must ask ourselves, what is the true cost of power? What happens when the blood that is meant to sustain a dynasty becomes the very poison that destroys it? The fall of these royal families serves as a stark reminder that power, when not tempered by wisdom and responsibility, can ultimately undo even the mightiest of empires. As we close this dark chapter, let us carry with us the knowledge that true strength does not lie in the purity of blood, but in the integrity of leadership and the wisdom of the people. The monsters created by royal inbreeding are long gone, but their legacy remains, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragile nature of power. And as we look to the future, we must ask, how far have we truly come from the dark days of royal bloodlines? How many of the lessons of the past have we learned, and how many are still waiting to be taught? Only time will tell. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more dark, twisted tales from history.